Ben Jarofsky, and I'm with the Chicago Reader and WCPT radio show. I'm moderating this panel discussion because I want to save journalism and also because Grace told me to. Pretty much do anything Grace tells me. And I do also want to acknowledge the Chicago Tribune reporters who are here, and I was very pleased in role as a member of the Newspaper Guild that they took that important first step. When we formed the guild, when we joined the guild at the Reader, part of the idea for why we did it was because we wanted to save our jobs. We were hoping that, of course, that would be paramount, I suppose. But also, at least speaking for myself, I thought that an organized group of journalists could help save the publication and help play a role in directing the publication toward a brighter future. Not just for the Reader, I suppose, but this is a dilemma that many newspapers are facing throughout the country. And so it's good to see the Tribune joining the task. And so congratulations on that 85%. It wasn't the 100% that we got, because I think I only pretty good. All right, so we have a great panel here to discuss the future of the press. They're going to come up with solutions to save journalism, and they're going to do it in 2 hours. We have Charles Whitaker, Associate Dean of Journalism, at the Medill School of Journalism. Edwin Eisendrath, CEO of Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago Reader. Patty Lamberti, Director of Multimedia Journalism at Loyola. Bernie Lunzer, he's the President of the News Guild. Maudlin Ihajarika from the Chicago Sun-Times, veteran journalist. And Jamie Calvin, an independent journalist from the Invisible Institute. Am I leaving anybody off? I don't believe. I think I got everybody here, right? All right, very good. So we did a drawing before to see who would be the first person to go, and Edwin actually volunteered to go first. So we'll start with Edwin, CEO of Chicago Sun-Times. Edwin didn't realize he volunteered until I just said it.
I heard 2 other people raise their hands.
Oh, excuse me, that is correct. Patty Lamberti volunteered to go first. Yes.
Oh, you didn't see me do this?
Yeah, that's what she does. That one volunteered. But Patty, I suppose you should go first with the general question, I guess, is are you optimistic about where we're heading sort of as a industry?
I am really optimistic. I think that the future of journalism can seem bleak, it can seem scary, but I had a recent experience a few weeks ago that gave me renewed hope. We always do recruiting events for students who are still in high school but are interested in Loyola, and they're still not sure where they want to major and what school they want to go to. So we hold basically a fair for the students and their parents. And we have representatives from each department across the university, but within the School of Communication, I represented journalism. There was someone who represented advertising PR. We have a film program and a communications program. And over the last 10 years when we've done this, I've gone to this event and I've been standing there alone, and none of the students and parents want to talk to me because the parents are convinced there's no jobs in journalism. And I think students think that sounds like a hard major, but this year was totally different. This was the first year that the advertising booth was completely empty. And we had 30 or 40 parents and students huddled around us at once to learn more about our journalism program. So I think that students, first of all, have a renewed interest in journalism, a renewed appreciation for it. And I think parents are finally starting to see there's real careers, real jobs, and important work to be done. So I do feel optimistic because I think millennials kind of get the importance of news again.
All right, well, it does seem that there's definitely, since Trump was elected, far more interest in supporting newspapers, if only because people who are opposed to Trump want it to be a form of resistance. Edwin, you now own, or you're the CEO of a conglomerate of people who own 2 newspapers, the Sun-Times and the Reader. I gather you felt the same way, that there needed to be resistance to Trump, which is partly what motivated you to put this group together to purchase it. Do you think that there is, in addition to the enthusiasm for newspapers, a solid business strategy for making them profitable?
So Ben, post-election trauma was certainly part of this for me, but it wasn't resistance to Trump. It was not. It was a terror about a loss of a shared sense of facts in America, a terror about a loss of sense of trust of anybody to describe our own world to us. And that predated Trump. You know, once, and it's been coming since the 1970s. Journalism is partly to blame for that, but so is this enormous wage gap that's grown ever since then. And I could talk about both of those, but I think you guys know it better than anybody. So I wanted to do this in part to find a way to establish a shared base of facts among the great group of people in the middle of the country. This anti-elitist feeling that the people who are in charge or who speak for them, whether they're journalists or politicians or corporate leaders, let us all down, is widespread. And I love the New York Times, I love the Wall Street Journal, I love the Washington Post and the Boston Globe, and you know what? They're not going to be believed in the middle of the country. They're just not. So I thought that the Sun-Times, which is not ever going to be confused as an elitist newspaper, creates an opportunity to rebuild trust, to rebuild it profoundly. The question, the statement on the wall behind me that democracy depends on journalism is absolutely right. But what does journalism depend on? And the answer for me is trust. And it's earned by the kind of careful, skilled reporting that people do, but also by doing it in a way that isn't elitist, that isn't divisive, that sometimes, after all, tells a story that people recognize as familiar. I do worry that we have focused on negative so much that you read any of our publications for a year and you don't recognize the city that you live in and love. We have to do a better job of being fully capable of telling the stories of the places we're at. And then do it when we do our investigative stuff, when you guys, I'm not a journalist, when you do your investigative stuff, do it with the kind of talent that so many of you have, that it's well-sourced, that it's transparent, that it stands up to the test of the debate that's coming. So that's why I did it, and that's why a lot of people did it. That's why you're seeing support from people in journalism again. None of that goes to the business model. Absolutely none of it speaks to the business model. It speaks to the urgency and the essential nature of making it work. The business model is a whole lot harder.
Well, what is the business model?
Well, everybody else can talk. I'll come back to it later.
All right. Let's go with Charles Whitaker from
So I do like to talk about the business model a lot because we talk about it with our students. We didn't used to do that in journalism school. We were pristine and we didn't sully our hands talking about business, but now we think it's really important for students to understand it. And while I am very hopeful about journalism, the business model is irreparably broken. And it's a stupid business model to begin with. We are the only business where we produce something that is really, really expensive to produce, and then we give it away as cheaply as possible so that someone else will pay to reach the people that we're giving it to. That is a dumb business model. It tells the people who consume our product that it's not valuable because it's free or at a tremendously reduced price. Your sneakers are made in Malaysia for $2 and then sold for $100. We produce content really, really expensively and then try to give it away so we can get somebody else to pay for it. And I don't think journalists understand that particularly well. The public certainly doesn't understand that. The great thing about this Facebook discussion is that it really is bringing home the fact that what we're selling is people. We're selling eyeballs, we're selling exposure, and the exposure model does not work in digital, particularly for media outlets, because what do you do when you are exposed to advertising and digital? You want to get rid of it. Advertisers know that, and they are never going to pay what they paid for print advertising, what they're paying for digital, what they pay for digital advertising. So this model is not working. And the only way we can combat that is to convince our consumers that this thing that we produce is really valuable. We have to stop undervaluing. We talk about the amazing talent that's in this room, the amazing talent that it takes to produce our content. We have to educate the public that that talent is as worthy of paying for exposure to as athletes and other people who are incredibly high priced. And unless we begin to make that case to the public, and I know there's a good reason for having journalism accessible as cheaply as possible, because we want everybody to, the democracy depends on everyone being educated. But if they're not getting it now, and if they undervalue it, even my wife, who's lived with a journalist all her life, hates paying for content. She wants to click off as soon as possible. And I say, dear, but that's how we have a roof over our heads. Unless we convince the public that they will pay for media and that they really have to pay what it is worth, we're going to continue chasing advertisers who are going to continue going to Facebook and Google, because search is much more valuable to them than having their advertising messages exposed in our media outlets, and that's a losing proposition for us.
All right, let's ask Jamie Calvin a question here, coming off of what Charles had to say. How do you convince consumers that the product you're producing is of such value that they should pay for it?
I think that's a question that relates to a range of institutions in addition to newspapers. Think about independent bookstores. All sorts of critical cultural institutions depend on our choices as consumers. And I actually don't think we yet have a cultural ethos that embraces that principle. I mean, I come at this from sort of the margins. I have never worked for a newspaper. I've been an independent reporter, and now am part of, an increasingly robust world of nonprofit journalism. The Invisible Institute is an independent journalism production company, for want of a better way of characterizing it. I don't for a moment want to suggest that that's the answer, that philanthropy coupled with modest revenues, from our work is the answer. I think it might be an ingredient in a recipe that we're looking for. So, there are in various niches, think ProPublica, the stuff that we do, the Marshall Project. There are these niches that can go really deep into a subject area, can stay with a story, can kind of intervene in the public discourse in a way that's much harder to do when you're putting out a paper from day to day, except for really big stories. I'd like to throw out one other dimension of this, which I think is concerning, relates to the business model, but can be thought of independently. As some of you might know, I recently was pulled into the Laquan McDonald murder case, was subpoenaed and was pressed to name sources of my reporting in the Laquan McDonald case. And I resisted on First Amendment grounds. After a couple of months, it was resolved when the judge quashed the subpoena, which never should have been issued in the first place. I think what was telling about the episode was not, I was in an extremely favorable position. I had pro bono legal representation, got support from the industry, was associated with a major story and case in which the role of the whistleblower was beyond, the importance of the whistleblower was beyond question. But I was left thinking about all the other scenarios in this present era of anti-press sentiment, where a relatively unknown reporter, a publication on life support economically. So I think these things are going to keep happening. What I don't want to suggest that what happened in the Van Dyke case is really a legal precedent, but to the extent that it exemplifies something, it suggests that any reporter reporting on a pending case could be called in, could be drawn into the case via subpoena with as little legal basis as there was in my case. There was zip. I mean, it was complete fake news sort of fabrication that got legal traction. So one of the questions I want to sort of throw out and introduce is, in a time of economic stress and struggle in the industry, how do we avoid self-censorship about important stories when these all sorts of publications are one frivolous libel suit away from closing their doors? So I think there's a question of, business model, and there's a question of fully discharging our responsibilities under the First Amendment under these conditions.
Yeah, that struggle has always been there to one degree or another, but perhaps now with papers aren't as wealthier as they used to be, maybe more expensive. You talked about a philanthropy model, and more newspapers are, and not just newspapers, but radio stations, et cetera, are asking their writers or their personalities to publicly call in for support. Morgan, as a working journalist on the panel, are you comfortable with that role, being asked to be like a WTTW subscription drive, that kind of thing?
Well, I think so much of what's been said. So much of what's been said already really goes to the heart of that, and Charles really spoke to my thinking about the quandary we find ourselves in with the industry. He very adequately described it. The model simply doesn't work. It doesn't make sense when you look at it on its face. And I've never heard it described so well. We sell cheaply, what we spend 10 times the amount producing in hopes that we can convince someone else to subsidize based on how many people are taking it, accepting it cheaply. So I mean, that's never going to work, and that's where we are. And so something's got to give. And so what happens? So we have to find a way, as everyone has said, to convince the public of the value of journalists, journalism / journalists, those who produce the news. And it's not too far from the same issues that we're seeing in other industries, as Jamie mentioned. For instance, I would raise education as a current arena where we're seeing educators rise up and say, this model doesn't work. We've been the lowest paid professionals across all industries for years, and we are amongst, I would venture, the most important, And so how do we convince the public that, industries like journalism and education are critical and that they should pay for it, whether through their taxes or whether through their subscriptions? And so I think the answer to that is, we're doing that at the Sun-Times now. We're doing what many newspapers before us have done. We're saying, hey, that journalism is important. And certainly every time there's been one breath of, this could be a one newspaper town, the whole city rises up and says, oh, that would be a horrible thing. And so, we're at that point now where we're saying, okay, yeah, I think we all agree it would be a horrible thing, but how do we support that? Can you put your money where your mouth is? Can we all agree and then do something about it? So I think that, journalists more and more are understanding that we have to sell ourselves. I mean, beyond the fact that we are in a social media and branding, journalist branding landscape, where people actually turn to news entities, not so much for the news entity, but for the individuals that they come to the word trust, as Edwin just mentioned. So, we've been in that landscape for some time, the understanding that we have to sell ourselves. And so this landscape that we find ourselves in now is not so far removed, where we are now saying, okay, yeah, I want you to read my material, but I also want you to read the Sun-Times and support the Sun-Times, because if you don't support the Sun-Times, I won't be here. And if I'm not here, and the Sun-Times is not here, you're only going to have a very small pie from which to get your news. So I don't have a problem with it, is the short answer. And in fact, look for my column selling myself in the Sun-Times in the next few days.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Marlon. And you talk about branding, you talk about journalists taking a greater role in the promotion of their newspaper. And Bernie Munzer, I have to ask you, traditionally, when I first started years and years ago, the union was more or less dedicated to bread and butter issues, talking about your basic salary, talking about, pension plans. Those things don't exist anymore. Health costs, etc. But now, I see that unions are getting more vocal about the strategy itself. What should we be doing as a collective group to save the paper, to promote the paper? And that may rub some bosses the wrong way because they don't want their employees telling them what to do. DNA just pulled the plug on it. Are you comfortable with that as a union leader, or do you wish we were back in the old days where it's shut up and just negotiate for your salary?
I think most journalists would prefer to just focus on their journalism. I don't think that's going to be possible in the near future. I really believe that the future of journalism is in large part up to the journalists and the larger journalism community, because right now we've got two major problems. One is that we've got a lot of valuable papers that are owned by hedge funds that really they're slumlords. They don't care about what they have as a product. And beyond that, with Facebook and Google search stealing really the audience, or stealing the revenue, I should say, they're not stealing the audience. Something there has to happen that has to be substantially different. There has to be a reckoning with Facebook and Google. We as a union, as a guild, we've been involved in ownership models in a substantial way since about 2005, when Knight Ridder started to blow up, and we almost bought the Philadelphia paper. Thank God we lost that one. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, but the truth of the matter is everyone that's here knows that there is no quick answer on the business model. But I do think that people are starting to get a better understanding of things that work. And I know for a fact that the more that the products that we represent, news organizations, not print versus web or whatever, we've got to get past that argument over the platforms, because it's news, and we have to be able to sell it. But I think that what is important is that things are tethered to the communities that they serve. And I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know that I'm not flat out saying that there's no place for capitalism in the news industry. I don't think that's true. But I do think that the more that people look at membership models in ways that people are loyal to their news, in ways that go beyond the old relationship. We certainly cannot rely on advertising in the short term. And I would tell you, too, that there are groups, very good groups like the News Media Alliance, which is a trade group, represents primarily newspapers. They're fighting to take on Google and Facebook so they can get some of that revenue back. But I think the key message here is that the journalism community, and especially the journalists, have to take the future in their own hands and advocate for what success looks like and how to get there. And it's important to note, too, that content producers of all kinds, musicians, you name it, the current digital age is really wreaking havoc. And so that question of what digital distribution means has to be answered across the board, I think.
Evan, do you subscribe to the notion that the membership model is the future for newspapers?
What membership model? The idea, so I mean, really what? The idea that people come to trust a group of folks to tell them the news and want to be part of that community building? Absolutely. The idea that everything is non-profit journalism, dependent on the beneficence of wealthy foundations, I'm uncomfortable with that a little bit. I've seen that model around the world.
Well,
And
like the
so,
Bernie Sanders model,
so-
not just wealthy foundations, but just
so-
lots of readers.
oh, sure, lots of, building community is all, journalism is about community building. It absolutely is about community building. And you can go all the way back to Bernie is standing in front of the cave. And I come out and he says, the saber-toothed tiger is to the left and food is to the right. You know, and he's either proven that he's got a community who can trust him in that. People are depending on that, right? And it isn't any different now in a democracy. You got to have somebody who's able to tell you the landscape. And trust is always, in humans, a community, a socially constructed phenomena. And you go downstairs to the philosophy department and talk about how humans come to understand things. Social constructed points of view are enormously important. Enormous. And again, we go back to where I started. When they fracture in a country like America, when you start to have different social constructs about reality, then people who are not our friends, and sometimes those are politicians, and sometimes they are hyper-partisan think tanks, and sometimes they are Russian government agents, and sometimes they're journalism organizations, figure out they can profit by further dividing us. You know, and so that's why democracy depends on journalism. You have to have a shared sense of what reality is. And that's about building a community of people. No one has been better at it in America, by the way, than Fox, that built a community of people that trust them no matter what they say. Right? Well, okay. I don't know if they've been so good about the fact part of it, right? But they found a way to build trust. So I'm attracted to the Sun-Times because you know what? Its readership and the Fox readership share a lot in common. They did not have the greatest ride for the last 30 years. I'm confident about America, though, that you know you can either look at the plate you've got and say, it's somebody else's fault I'm standing in this stew, or you can say, you know, the happiest moment for me in the entire last election was when the students at Liberty University wrote a letter to their president saying, you know what, this endorsement isn't in the values of the faith community that we have. I think there's a sense that whether it's in the faith community or anybody else or these hedge funds, there's a certain kind of idolatry that we as a culture have to deal with.
Charles, you think the Fox model is the way to go, or you just sort of preach to the choir?
That's not what I said.
Yeah, I was going to correct him, Edwin. I was actually going to say, yeah, I don't think that's what Edwin is saying. I think what he's saying is journalism has always been about galvanizing community. I mean, when people ask me my definition of journalism, I say it is dissemination of information to a community, regardless of platform. And so what Fox has done, as Edwin so eloquently said, was construct a shared version of reality and is pitching that shared version of reality to those viewers, and they have done that very, very successfully.
Man, can I add one thing? Because it's relevant here in Chicago with the Sun-Times and the Tribune. Do you guys all know why the Sun-Times came into existence? I mean, it was a reaction to Colonel McCormick around World War II. And it was a sense that there was a community of Chicagoans who did not feel that isolationism was the way to go, but that the world required a more robust response that brought the Sun-Times into being. And it was formed largely for the purpose of creating community around we ought to be involved in what's going on in the world. And it came into being just 2 months before Pearl Harbor, and the owners then said, now what do we do? Because America came around to that point of view pretty quickly, you know, on December 7th.
Yeah. Well, the point about the Fox model, getting to what Charles was saying about the dissemination of information, that suggests that there is a large group of people in this country who are sort of open-minded about issues and want to hear one point of view and another point of view, and then actually can agree upon a certain collective group of things called facts. I'm not quite sure that exists anymore, particularly on watching the evening coverage of what's going on with Trump in Washington. So that's what I was getting at. Like, if you just want to make money off your newspaper, then you could just find an audience that just wants to hear whatever you have to say and then preach it to them. What I was asking is, do you think there's a way to make money or to stay in business, maybe make money if you're not for profit, by being quote unquote objective, like it was in the Standard, that as they teach objectivity, I presume, at Medill or at Loyola. So I guess I'll.
So Ben, I think the answer is yes, and I'm praying it's yes, and I'm working hard to make it yes. But I do think corporate culture matters. I think corporate point of view matters. The Sun-Times and the Tribune attracted audiences because they both had good journalists. They still both have good journalists, but they have different points of view. I think it matters that the Tribune editorialized that Gary Johnson should be president, and that Sun-Times didn't. I think that stuff turns out to matter. That one editorial board says Trump's tax cuts are good for Chicago, they were good for Trump. The other had a different point of view. That's nothing about the good journalists that are there. But you guys belong, many of my colleagues at the Sun-Times once shared the same kind of corporate culture. They're the same, after all, owners for a while. Corporate culture matters. And now skipping out of journalism for a second, across the country, in industry after industry, lots of Americans are working in organizations that they're not 100% proud of, whose values they don't share, whose contributions they can't stand. And we have grown complacent a little bit, not just journalists, everywhere. And let me remind you, in Chicago, that the faculty at the YMCA college in the 1940s, early 1940s, were told they couldn't admit minority students, so they walked across the street, they called up Eleanor Roosevelt and said, can we call it Roosevelt University? And it's still here. So I do think people have more agency than we know, but we've been a little timid.
Well, you're talking about two things: an editorial voice, which, like for instance, the Tribune couldn't bring itself to endorse Hillary Clinton, and then, of course, the paper itself. I'm not even sure how many people read editorials anymore or buy their newspapers based on editorials. If that were the driving force, the Tribune would have gone out of business a long time ago, because the city voted 80% for Hillary Clinton and 80-something% for Barack Obama. The Tribune's editorial voice could barely bring itself to endorse either one. Did they endorse Barack Obama in 2012?
Yes.
Well, that was nice of them.
I'm talking about corporate culture and point of view, and it matters a lot in the country. And there are people working for Alden Capital-owned papers, like in Denver. And they're starting to say, you know what, maybe not. And I think that turns out to be important, particularly when the assets are being pulled away. I mean, Trump Tower in Chicago sits where the Sun-Times used to be. That was an $87 million partnership with the Sun-Times. Not a lot of that money went back into journalism.
I would say you can take a lot of that out of that sentence. Jamie, so what's your thoughts about this, the future of a paper as sort of being, having a worldview or point of view? Do you think that's important to try to bring in leadership to the readers, that people know that they can trust the paper?
I think I would put it somewhat differently. I think a paper needs to have a strong identity. That doesn't necessarily have to be a fixed worldview. I mean, you could have, and I think, the Sun-Times, as it rehearses a rebooted persona, has some of this quality. A feisty local paper that is trying to establish a direct relationship to its readers. And I think there's also, sort of our classic aspirations in journalism to be providing a common evidentiary basis for people to have the necessary arguments in a democracy. Those arguments can take place within a newspaper as well as between newspapers. And that's the newspaper I want to read. You know, one where I have confidence in the reporting, but also it's a robust conversation and it pushes me, you know, and opens me to new points of view. I think there's something else that's maybe been implicit in the conversation that should be lifted into, be made more visible and explicit, which is, I think, you know, I just was at a conference of investigative reporters out in the Bay Area, and I think there's a danger for journalism in being Trump obsessed. And I mean, there are multiple dangers. And I think one of the opportunities that the Sun-Times has is to regenerate journalism from the ground up in terms of what people need to know about the places where they live, about the issues that bear directly on their lives, to do that in a way that has the kind of, you know, embodied credibility of particular reporters you trust to tell you things you need to know about, you know, which way the saber-toothed lion is and which way the food is. And I think that there's an opportunity in that, and if we get sucked too much into Fox News Trump land, into the, you know, collective hallucinatory stuff, we sort of lose our bearings and there's nothing distinctive about what we do or what we contribute. And, you know, I've come to think of Trump as, for all the other things one might say, as a master propagandist. You know, if you look at how propaganda works in totalitarian and authoritarian countries, it's not, you know, the stuff that's being pumped out is not meant to persuade you. It's not meant to be credible. It is meant to displace everything else, to take over the public sphere. And I think part of the mission of journalism right now is to take back the public sphere. You know, and I think it's easier to do that in a local, I mean, this is a huge setting, but it's still a local setting. And to think about our practice that way. One of the things, somebody quoted Marty Barron, you know, the celebrated editor of the Washington Post, at the symposium I attended recently. Apparently he called his newsroom together after Trump was elected and said, he's a man of very few words, said, don't go to war, go to work. And I think sort of, I mean, you can interpret that a lot of different ways, but I think thinking about what that means in terms of our day-to-day practice as journalists, and not getting caught up too much in something that will just dissipate our best efforts.
Well, Jamie, it's interesting because every day I get 5 news updates from the Washington Post, and almost every instance there's a Trump a related story, most of which is about the chaos and confusion in the Trump administration. And so I think you're absolutely correct. We've allowed Trump to take control of our media. But I also think that the Washington Post has figured out as a business strategy, plugging into people who really can't stand Trump is the way to get those clicks, and that's so important, it seems.
It's also that's their local paper, right? I mean, it's the Washington Post, so that's really their beat.
Yeah, well, yeah, but
You can't discount the deep pockets of Jeff Bezos.
Oh,
I mean, none of that is possible unless you have just unlimited. Yes, it is driving lots of traffic, and there are lots of things that we can do as journalists to drive traffic and get clicks. Most of it is unseemly. Most of it are things that we don't want to do. But you are only able to take the high ground, like the Washington Post, if you have tremendous amounts of cash to fund that. I mean, that is just not possible. So again, this isn't really. We sometimes, and as we should, become so obsessed with, you know, how do we make the journalism better? We can't make the journalism better if we don't have the funding, right? If we don't figure out the business, the journalism suffers, and then we just do cat videos to get clicks, right? So, yeah.
Our metrics are just on the math of the business for us. We look at engagement as much as we look at you know, clicks. How long does somebody spend with a piece? You know, they air for 1 second and gone. They just look at the headline, or they actually spend a little time to absorb what's in it. We do spend, I mean,
But
and that's,
Edward, isn't it true? But none of that matters if you can't tell the advertiser that after they were engaged with you, they then went to them and purchased blah, blah, blah. I mean, the problem with this model is ROI is really trackable in digital in ways that it wasn't in print.
right, so that engagement is, the reason for the engagement is not for the advertisers, because your original point is 100% correct. It's to get them to join your
Yes,
community,
you're right.
to become
Absolutely.
digital subscribers, which,
Yes.
by the way, we just launched a digital subscription drive. Everyone, www.sometimes.com. It's a very good deal. Very good deal. Please sign up, matters. And you know, just so we're all clear, and we're all in the family here after all, right? If I asked, and you asked and embarrassed my colleagues in the newsroom of the Sun-Times, how many of you are subscribers to the paper? You know what, I would not, it would be very embarrassing, right? It really would. So I don't ask that question because I actually know the answer.
Well, Edward, you was subscribing?
Yes,
Actual newspaper?
actual
All
newspaper.
right, oh, man. All right.
And by the way, I get a
I
tribute
get
to
to my beloved bright one home delivered every day.
So it's, right, that's why engagement
You are correct.
matters.
You're absolutely right.
All right, well, I have a question for you. Let's talk about clicks. Has to be addressed by a working journalist on this panel here. There is an obsession with clicks, no matter what anybody says. Every week, I think it is the Reader, don't they come out with like the top 10 clicks? So whether it's, they never do the top 10 clicks, like who read this, who spent the most time on the story, it's like who got the most clicks. So when you are writing a story, are you thinking these days, are you thinking clicks, man, I gotta show Edwin, I got these X amount of clicks, is that even in your mind at all?
You know, if that was the measure, I would have been gone a long time ago. Edwin would have shown me the door, because, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm a little different animal. I cover, for those of you who don't know, I write a column called Chicago Chronicles, which are long-form pieces profiling people and places that make Chicago tick, with a focus on Black and brown communities. So my beat is diversity. My beat is race. My beat is the other. And so my beat also is the positive, because as we've said across this panel, the majority of what you read in whether it's my newspaper or the one across the street does not reflect the neighborhoods in which we live. Because we live in those neighborhoods. We don't see, Ram is not in our neighborhood running roughshod. The guy who got shot and the kid who got murdered, they weren't on our block. On our block, we know our neighbors. On our block, we know the small businesses that have hung on, even as the neighborhoods were disinvested. On our block, we know the woman who comes out and cleans up the block, because she's lived there forever, even though her home value has just, tanked. She's holding on. On our block, we know the kid raised by the single mother who, despite what my newspaper and the one across the street tells you, is a good kid with a 2.5, 2.8 GPA, comes home every day, walks his little brother home, and he's hoping to get to college on scholarships, and he's struggling. My neighborhood is all of those things, but you don't get those if you just look at the major pages of my newspaper or the one across the street. You do get them in my column. That's my job. My job is to tell you those stories that you would never know about unless someone cared. I care because it's my community. So to your point, what I cover, it doesn't get clicks. It's not clickbait. What I cover because it needs to be covered. Because we need diversity of stories within the newspaper. I don't want to see the Black and brown kids who have been murdering and maiming. I'm tired of it. Keep your keep your stories about my black and brown youth criminals. What I want is the positive stories that I know are 80% of the kids in my neighborhoods, the black and brown neighborhoods, who are just trying to make it and who have good, decent families, despite the poverty and the crime that surrounds them. So that's my job. My job ain't clickbait. You're not gonna buy the paper for my stories. But you're going to read my stories when you see them, when you stumble across them, and they're gonna make a difference to you, and you're gonna remember them. So I may not be providing the clickbait, but I provide that value, that thing that people say, that's what the Sun-Times is about. They care. They're about the little guy. They're about the voiceless. They're about the diversity. They're about everybody. And so the short answer is my stories, no, I don't write for clickbait because I don't care if you click or not. I'm here to provide diversity in the other voices. And thank God that my new owner supports that. Thank God, because those stories ain't clickbait.
I have just a quick question to follow up. You said you're not going to buy the paper for my stories. Are you aware from response that you get whether people are reading those columns that you write on the internet, or most of your readers, at least the ones who respond to you, still reading it on the actual newspaper?
My stories draw huge email, and it's from people who have read it online.
I see.
Yeah. So I don't know what the metrics show, but yeah.
Well, sadly though, across the country, metrics, these digital metrics, even to the point of display boards in some places, they are driving still decision-making, and it's hollow, it's empty, it's not a path forward. I will tell you that right now what I see in the overall society is a sense that American institutions have failed the average person. I don't think media has done that. I do think that it's trying very hard to be the anecdote to the failure of these institutions. And the problem, though, is still, and the reason why we're sitting here talking, is how do we fund it? How do we make it work? And so, this is a social good. And people don't necessarily want to pay for a social good. How do we pay for it? I think we can figure it out. But I think we have to deconstruct some of the things that are happening right now.
Well, I think there's an agreement generally that the clickbait is not going to bring in advertising revenue. Patty, I have to ask you, are journalism schools teaching their students to think about how they can build revenue? Are they still, are they teaching them to think about being a part of this larger conversation, like bringing in subscribers? Is that what you're teaching that? Or is it
Probably not enough. Of course I am, but I don't know about my colleagues. I do think that students need to have a better understanding of the business model. One thing students always say is, well, I hate math. That's why I'm in journalism, because I don't want to have to learn anything about business, and I don't want to have to crunch any numbers. So I try to tell them math isn't scary. They can really do it. Once I actually give them an analytics report, they get really into it and they love it, but they're not going to do it on their own. One thing I emphasize as we talk about the business model is website usability and how people read text on screens, because I think that's something all journalists can learn. I think it's something that would help at least generate more readers online and definitely get people to stay on pages longer. If we would do simple things like double space after every sentence, and make sure that our websites have the correct font and are readable. And that's something that I don't see every online newspaper doing. I see CNN doing it. They'll make a lot of use of white space on a page, but most online publications still aren't doing that.
Yeah, we have evidence that you're absolutely right. We redesigned our website. Traffic went way up. The load times are faster. We forewent revenue by getting rid of a bunch of ads that block the page, and readership is up online a lot, actually, since December. Maudlin, will you take a second and talk about something else that that you did, because it's also important. Your passion and the care that you take to write what you write is clear when you get to talk to a group like this, and it's clear in your story. But you and Mary just sat in front of a camera and talked about the decision-making that went into how do you cover the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. This is something that we're doing a lot to help people who don't get to hear in person, but to help people understand how we think about how we cover stories. That's part of that trust building. You want to talk a little about that?
Just briefly, so we're doing this new segment called Working the Story. And what we do is when there are major stories or very interesting stories, we have our reporters sit down in front of a camera and just talk, just chat, just jaw-jack about how did it come about, how did you pursue the story, how did you find the story, and how did you get it done. And what we find is it goes exactly to, again, that trust and that community building. You know, when people come to the Sun-Times because, oh, they want to read maudlin stories, or they want to read Mary's columns, you know, or our major investigative team that, you know, people just like come in droves to see their stuff. When people trust these individuals, it then builds greater community when they get to see how these individuals do their work. And so what we've done is we've had the reporters sit down and just really dissect in a very conversational tone, well, how did you find that story? Then what? Then what did you do? Then who did you talk to? How did you pull it together? And so Mary and I recently did, you know, the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination, and it was just that whole process of, okay, we all know MLK 50 is coming up, so how do you begin to pull together the stories? Where do you find the stories? How do you find the stories? How do you choose which ones? Because you can only do so many. And then within a landscape where there are limited funds and we're not sending anyone to the destinations where the majority of these commemorations are taking place, how do you make impact where you are? And so we talked about just the 3 or 4 stories that we did, and one of them was a story about Ruby Bridges, who was the little girl in the Norman Rockwell painting who was being in between 4 white federal marshals, and she's walking past a wall that's splattered with the N-word and tomatoes and everything else that has been thrown at her, and she's got her head up regally. She's only 6. And she's carrying her book and her ruler, and she doesn't see anything that's going on. All she knows is her mother told her, you're going to get an education. And so the story, I mean, that picture, that's all we know about that picture. But 50 years later, I'm going through my inbox, which is 27,000 deep, and I'm looking for those pitches that are going to move people. What story can I write to make people understand what MLK 50 is really about? And there, I stumble across a pitch from a nonprofit in Chicago who happens to have gotten Ruby Bridges to be their keynote speaker on May 5. And I call and I'm like, can I get her on the phone now? And I do an interview with her, and it was so amazing. I could barely speak because she's taking me back to that day, getting her dress on, what her parents told her. Back in those days, kids were to be seen and not heard. So they never told her you're going to an all-white school. They never told her you're integrating a school. They never told her you'll be the only black child there. They never told her the white men that are coming to the door are federal marshals. All they told her was, it's your first day of school and you better behave. And so one little girl who carried the burden of a nation on her back did so without any knowledge about what she was doing. And she did it like an adult. And so anyway, we spoke about that on camera, and it went viral, it went national. People really clicked into that whole inside scoop.
So the reason, I brought it up because you asked about business decisions, right? There's a cost associated with, like, get the camera, spend the time, take them out of doing some actual reporting, and have these stories, right? And I don't know whether these bets are going to pay off or not. I don't. I'm terrified. I love this job 20 hours a day, and then 4 hours a night I sit up shivering. I just, right? But the bet that we're making here is that if we can let people know what you just saw, right, there's going to be, the people are going to say, we want to be part of this. This is how we want to learn about the places we live.
I think, can I add that I think I was in another conversation about this recently, that people generally, passionate consumers of news, don't actually know what's involved in doing to do a major investigative story.
Right.
The level of care, what due diligence really means,
They don't know at all.
What people simply don't know, and I think that's actually a failure on our part. And you don't want to make yourself as a reporter the story, but there should be ways, what was it called, working the story?
Working the story.
I mean, I think publications should be thinking about how you create a portal, a window on what's really involved in doing quality journalism, and also what it costs. I mean, that story, this is why there's the community in the sense of identification with a publication, but there's also this thing we talked about initially, the consumer choice, the power of the consumer choice as an ethical matter to say, this is a critical institution, it really costs, I understand, I appreciated that story, I read it with interest, and now I understand how the sausage was made, and I'm going to support it all the more. I think we've almost completely failed to do
All right,
that.
well, let me play a little devil's advocate with you.
Yeah.
I was listening to what Mom was saying about building and trust, and explaining how reporters get to the stories. Probably the biggest story politically, one of the biggest stories politically globally of the last 3 months or so, were the revelations in the Chicago Tribune about private conversations between Rob Blagojevich and J.B. Pritzker that took place 10 years ago. And the Tribune has, I believe, done am I correct, 2 major leaking of tapes, and in each case, they've not indicated where they received the tapes or how they received the tapes. You talk about trust.
Yeah.
I mean,
How
now
many
I
more
know
say?
you were ready to go to jail rather than reveal your source, but at some point, don't you think the public deserves to know who the source of these leaked tapes are?
I mean, it depends. I mean, it depends on the circumstances, and I'm not. I read the stories, but I'm not. Yeah.
I just say no. I mean, I think that we know what happens when people are pushed into revealing their sources. I think that the Tribune has an obligation to make the story credible, but I think that's different than revealing a source. My feeling.
That's exactly what
I agree with that too.
Yeah.
Completely, Ben. The reason you talk about sources is to demonstrate credibility. I don't think there was anybody who listened who didn't think that was authentic, right? It's a different story how they got it, but the story itself, no one was saying, "Oh, they faked that. We got to do provenance on this tape to be sure it was the real thing." Everybody kind of knew that was the real thing. The question though is, are there more? Are they sitting on more? I mean, is this, that's a different question.
Well, no, it's part of the same thing, because they did one story, and then how many weeks went by, and all of a sudden they did a second story. So I'm like, wait a minute, why didn't you just release it all? Why didn't you just have the secret tapes, blood on Tonight's the Pritzker? Like a 3-part series, like old school journalism, right? They waited like, how long did they wait? Like 2 weeks? And then all of a sudden, like the second story was buried in it wasn't even, that was the one where the embarrassing conversations about Reverend Wright and Jesse White, et cetera. They buried that into a larger story about how the governors were trying to get black voters to vote for them. So it wasn't even like, hey guys, guess what we found? This really embarrassing. So I would say that's exhibit A of a newspaper that's kind of losing, its credibility because it's not coming clean with its readers, about how many of these tapes they have. And as everyone is saying, are there more? As soon as they didn't put them all together and publish it as one, then it leads to all these questions. So, Edwin, I would suspect, don't you think that if all of a sudden in October, there's a 3rd tape where Pritzker says it's the most outrageous thing of it all, wouldn't you think that the paper, just to show its faith and credibility with its readers, would have to, at that point, at least explain why it took 4 months or 5 months in between revelations?
You can't ask me that. I mean, but right, my credibility in answering that is, I'm impeached as a witness on that one.
Well, I'll say this, that based on workload and the number of available journalists, I mean, that could be a factor. I don't know that it is here, and maybe they are, trotting it out slowly for other reasons, but one of the problems we have right now is some really great investigative stories are not happening, or are happening more slowly than they should because of lack of staff. Let's just be honest about it.
Absolutely. All right, so Charles and Patty are journalist professors. You want to weigh in on this discussion of the ethics of sources, dribbling out stories over a period of time?
You're asking sort of two different questions. I mean, when do you reveal your sources? And universally, we sort of feel that in these sort of investigations, one doesn't. But to what end do you reveal a source, or to what end should you? I believe in transparency. I do think transparency is our friend, but there are instances in which it is not in the best interest of the paper, nor is it does it do a disservice to the public not to reveal that source? And those are sort of conversations that we're having all the time. I don't know that you're getting at, what nefarious, dubious grounds on which the Tribune is hiding this source, hiding these sources, other than to drive traffic. And if drive traffic is the only nefarious thing that they are holding that source back for, so be it. Whatever. I don't find this to be a particularly troubling ethical dilemma.
But aren't we talking about two different things? I mean, there's the issue of protecting sources, which,
Right.
and then your word, Charles, transparency.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about building trust, like any institution, transparency is a critical tool in that. And
But if you apply that standard to-
you can firstly protect a source for a variety of reasons.
Right.
And be transparent about the process.
Absolutely.
And about what you have.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of transparency, and protecting sources, I don't find, because I deal with a lot of younger students and really learn about, how they view journalism, they kind of seem to believe every source, and they don't care if the person actually doesn't reveal their last name. They're okay with that. They actually don't even almost notice that, I don't think. And I don't think there's anything wrong with dribbling out stories. I mean, we live in a Hulu world where, I can't wait for next Wednesday to watch the new Handmaid's Tale. So I actually think if that's a tactic to get people to keep checking a website and become regular readers, it's a good tactic.
All right, very good. We've been talking among ourselves. It's time we take some questions from the audience. Yes, Mr. Bob Ryder in the background there.
So this conversation about the Tribune and the tapes I find interesting. You guys were talking about it, not saying anything directly. And I think, Ben, what you're asserting, you and I have probably talked about this before,
A few times.
is the Tribune is releasing the tapes. There's a lot of space. They're not saying where they're getting it from. So is there a decision somewhere, not at the reporter level, but is there something happening towards the top where they're trying to put their finger on the scale because of the timing of it during the primary, and then if something comes out in October, which I think you're suggesting, does that then go to, is there credibility issues then with what they're doing with the information? Are they withholding it not to protect the source, but to protect themselves? Because I think that's different, right? Protecting is confidential informant is one thing, but protecting yourself, because I'm not suggesting that that's what happened, but I think that's the question. Is there something in the air there?
Yeah, I personally believe the Tribune should come clean and explain why there was that gap between the first story where Blago asked for the job and then the second story where they made fun of Jesse White and Reverend Wright, etc. And so we should know. I believe that in the era of transparency, what Evan was talking about, what Maud was talking about, what Charles, what all of you are talking about is really important for newspapers to maintain their credibility. They're under siege right now, as it is, from Donald Trump for promoting fake news. And I'm not saying that the Tribune should release its source. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that they should reveal what they're up to. You know, and why, again, the big question is, why was this delay? And I don't see a parallel to The Handmaid's Tale.
That was just the pleasure of serialization.
Yeah, no, I understand serialization, but serialization suggests that there's like a pattern. Like The Handmaid's Tale is like every day at a certain time, there's going to be an episode, there's an episode next week. So like, when's the next episode on the Blago Pritzker tapes coming out? I bet it's not after the election, that's for sure.
I spent a lot of part of my life in politics, and so it matters to me a bit. But I think the realm of politics is too big in America, too big, and partisanship blinds people to all kinds of things. I don't want to say, I don't have any evidence of this, and I don't want to go down the road of saying the Tribune is partisan in its use of stories. I don't want to do it, and I have every reason to be upset with the Tribune, the corporate Tribune, but I don't want to do that. I think that's bad for journalism, and it's bad for America. I want to shrink, I want to focus on, and this is what the Sun-Times is really trying to do, and the journalists there are fabulous at this, focus on the lived experience of Chicagoans, of the working men and women who are here, and making that our passion. And the politics will sort itself out. Because if we tell those stories and tell them genuinely, we begin to get the fact base again. That doesn't mean we don't do investigations, and it doesn't mean we don't cover politics, but it does mean, this is the question of Trump in the air, that we don't let it take all the oxygen, that we focus on us, after all. We're a democracy, right? I mean, I spent a lot of my life in Saudi Arabia, where you focus on the king, right? That should not be us. We are agents responsible for the country we live in. All of us have this agency, and we better not forget it and get complacent and say somebody will take care of us. And journalism is core to that. But it isn't core, it isn't going to be believed if it's only seen through a partisan lens. Partisanship is not that important. We should, all of us, focus on our lives and what it means, and tell all of politics to get back where it belongs. And we can talk about one issue or another issue and argue about it, but not one worldview and another, and argue about it in one country.
All right, any other questions? Yes, Maya?
I have a question for the two folks who work with students and young people and are plugged into academia here. I feel like there's a lot of, I'm a staff writer at The Reader. I feel like there's a lot of assumptions about audience out there, a lot of assumptions about what news consumers want, what kind of content do they want, how they consume content, that's really based on very kind of a shaky foundation that doesn't really go beyond how people click, but there seems to be kind of a dearth of information about audience engagement and what kind of information people want, or whether even what people click on can be connected with audience loyalty. So I don't know, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, about if you're seeing anything.
There actually is a fair amount of research on audience engagement and what people, there are whole scholars who do nothing but study audience engagement and what people click on.
Our media business, at least in Chicago, is sufficiently connected to that body of knowledge and research and understanding.
Well, much of what you will hear about audience engagement and what people click on, we don't want to hear as journalists. I mean, that is not really what because again, you can push cat videos and get lots of people to click. I mean, there are lots of things that we know entertainment news gets people to click. We know that salacious headlines get people, we know a lot about search engine optimization. We know a lot about how people engage. And so the question becomes, how do we get them to engage just as passionately with the things that we think are important for the maintenance of the democracy? How do we get them to engage and stay just as interested in what Kanye tweeted or what Trump tweeted for that matter, as they are about the story that Maudlin wrote about the young man in his neighborhood, right? And there are things that we can do to heighten that engagement. I think Edwin and Maudlin have talked about how we can sort of heighten that engagement, but it still doesn't really compete with the engagement of some of the more salacious and silly material that we actually don't, not that we don't want people to view, but that we don't consider as important, if you will. I don't know if Jake can add.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a big stereotype about millennials out there. And some of it is true, especially as we're going into finals week at Loyola. You know, there's some that are driving me nuts right now. But I also think part of that is people think millennials are self-entitled. They're only interested in themselves. They're only interested in celebrity news, entertainment news. And I find that to be not true. I think they are willing to engage with long-form, important journalism if they can get it in the format that they want. And I think it's important to remember when we talk about young people not trusting the media anymore, we also have to remember they don't trust anything. They've lost faith in the government, they've lost faith in education, they've lost faith in the economy. So they're just, they're very pessimistic about almost everything.
One last thing about building trust. And it's a lesson that journalists should take from community organizers and politicians, really. We ought to take our show on the road more. We ought to, nothing beats being in a room with somebody. I mean, this experience you just had with Maudlin. If we did this all day long in venues all over the city, we'd have bigger audiences. So we try and do it via video, but we're in one city. We can actually get out and do news events. And we're trying a little bit. We have stood up an events business, and some of it is related to having our journalists have a platform to talk to people about the news in a different kind of way. And it's another way of building trust, and a enormously powerful one.
I just got a word that a couple of our panelists have to head out pretty soon, so if there are any more questions.
My name is Michael O'Connor. You asked a question concerning, well, you made a statement on this panel, most of you have made the statement concerning community engagement in terms of journalism, specifically as it concerns Chicagoans. So my question would be, when will there be news events in places like Chicago State? Places that are if you look around the room, it's mostly white. 33% of the population is African American. 33% is Latino. So if you're talking about expanding print, specifically as it concerns the Sun-Times and the Tribune, when are you going to do that?
So at the Sun-Times, maybe, again, ask Maudlin to talk about it instead of me, but my biggest surprise the first day I walked into the Sun-Times was that there were almost no women in positions of authority in the entire company, and there were very few people of color anywhere to be seen. And we have made some progress in the newsroom and in the whole company. And we made the progress wasn't motivated, although it's completely true, it wasn't motivated by going out and trying to find people of color and women. What we did was determine that we would have the widest funnel possible and get the best talent we could find anywhere. And gee whiz, guess what happened? Women and people of color now have a much bigger role in the company than they ever did before. And we're going to keep doing it. And once we do that, you know what? We're going to cover communities better, because I don't think the journalists who were there before were in any way bad journalists, but you know what? You know what you know. And not everybody lives on Maudlin's block. So we do have to have these different experiences that we bring to even the objective business of journalism, and you do it better.
Just to mention, It's interesting to me that I'm president of the National Association of Black Journalists, Chicago chapter, and today we joined with the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, Chicago chapter, to host a job fair over at Charles Whitaker's house, Medill. And so that's why Charles and I have to go back to wrap up that event that started at 10 and ends at 3:30. But my point being, we put this out there, and we registered 75 people. 75 African-American, Latino, and Asian current journalists, underemployed journalists, or students, recent grads, and soon-to-be grad students in journalism. When we arrived today, we were swarmed. 150 journalists came through there of all shades and hue. And they are still trying to enter the business. And so I was very shocked because, you know, we hear that the business is struggling. We hear that, you know, don't go into the news business. You don't want to go into the news business. Number one, you know, the internet has killed it. Number two, there's no diversity. You know, the industry has constricted, and there are fewer entities, and so therefore you have a lesser chance of getting in. But black and brown and yellow and all hues are still trying to come in, enter, get their foot through the door, and make their voices heard in covering those communities I just talked about. So how do we impact the diversity issue? Well, yes. I'm not even gonna sit up here and tell you that and sugarcoat it. When Edwin bought this newspaper, it was me and Mary Mitchell. And I can tell you the many, many stories, and where we go into each other's offices and we just look at each other. Not only was it just me and Mary Mitchell in terms of color, but it was, there's no women. There was one woman. And so today, a year later, we have a woman of color on our editorial board. We have a woman of color as a digital editor. We have, two additional journalists of color. And so, we're not counting beans. We're just saying that if you cast the net wide, you get a diversity of voices. You bring more to your reader, to your consumer. And so that's what we're doing, and my point in all of this is to say, today we did this, and thank God that when we put the call out to the media, including my boss, they said, yeah, we need to be there. And even though the businesses are struggling, we want those candidates. We want them on file. We may not have a position today, but we may have one tomorrow, and we don't want to say we can't find them. So that's how you impact it. It's happening, it's slow, it's one step at a time, and remember, it's more difficult in this landscape because the landscape has constricted.
Ben, plug the reader a little bit, or ask Maya why the reader is really important for giving opportunities for minority journalists.
Maya,
Wow.
don't be nervous.
Thanks for the invitation to the panel. Why is the reader important to minority journalists? That's your question?
Yes.
I mean, the reader is important to people who want to learn how to write, because the reader is the only place in Chicago that publishes long-form investigative journalism, criticism, features, profiles on a weekly basis. So, and we have a cadre of editors who are really good at what they do. The reader is basically Chicago's New Yorker. So for people who want to be writers, who want to be the people who are publishing books in 5 or 10 years, who want to be producing film, who want to be producing long-form immersive audio storytelling, the reader has been a launching pad for people like that for years, for decades. So we are the only people in Chicago who can provide that kind of training to young writers. So I think that historically, that pathway has really only been available to white men over the years. years. We've gotten better at bringing women into this, but there's a lot of effort being made now. There's a lot of interest among the staff to try to bring in more diverse voices. And, you know, we need resources. We need investment.
You have to do without hiring anybody.
We need resources to be able to do this. And when people leave, we need to be able to rehire for the positions that are left vacant. That's what we need. That's how we're going to diversify our staff.
And on that,
Well, you asked Maya.
I know, we had this conversation, but I thought it was worth saying.
No, it's
to the
very
whole room.
important, yeah. The reader, well, we're talking about the reader now.
And we need our freelance budgets not to be cut because people who aren't already wealthy cannot afford to write a 5,000-word feature for $400. That may take them 3 months to write. That's not a way to attract anybody except for well-to-do white men to this work.
What happens when you bring smart journalists to the negotiating table, and they talk about greater issues. But yeah, the reader, as far as I know, has been really struggling for the last 10 years. It's a whole other story. We want to have a whole story about the reader, but it gets into the issue of investment, where the money's going to come from, who is going to be paying for these salaries, whether the reader's going to generate the money, should the reader go to you know, more of the sponsorship model, the membership model that we were talking about earlier. All these things have to be addressed when we think about the future of an all-weekly like the Reader, which is so valuable to the city of Chicago for many reasons, if only because it's a different perspective on the news.
I have a question for Jamie, as one of the panelists out here who's sort of on the frontier of, I think, a business model for journalism that didn't exist 10 years ago. What do you think the limitations are of what you're trying to do with the City Bureau, where your funding sources are grants, you don't really have an advertising model in place? I mean, what are the limitations? Why can't that be the direction for journalism?
Well, you know, City Bureau is it's not an invisible institute, but it's a standalone now. You know, sort of, we were midwives, and it's got its own independent existence. And the idea there, I mean, I think consistent with some of what we've been saying about regenerating journalism from the ground up, is to create sort of a pipeline and career lines for young journalists, particularly journalists, as Edwin was saying a moment ago, who bring the asset of knowing what they know about the places where they live, being grounded in the city. I mean, that's an extraordinary asset. And I think, you know, one of the things that we talk about a lot in you know, my practice is sort of, how do you know what you know? You know, how do people know what they know? And there are certain things that can only be learned on the ground and only learned by the people most affected by whatever the larger policy or phenomena is. I think journalism has almost completely abandoned that. I mean, partly because of skewed priorities, partly because of economic constraints. And so, you know, City Bureau and the kind of work we do at the Invisible Institute with a more immersive, sort of ethnographically rich engagement with the settings we write out of, is an effort to recover that. And I'm actually really encouraged to hear, you know, a similar resonance in the way folks from the Sun-Times are talking, because I think that's a path forward. That then, you know, speaks to people, people identify with it, it's useful in a day-to-day sense, and it ceases to be journalism as a spectator sport, which I think is what the Fox News model and all this other stuff is. Mm-hmm. It's a spectator sport. Right. And I think there's a huge danger, going back to some of the broader themes of democratic norms and practices that Edwin was talking about. I don't want to, overdo the coming back to Trump again, but there are all sorts of people I know, some of the most intelligent, well-informed, morally sensitive people I know, are in part because of their
journalistic diet feel that, I think it's actually their lived experience, feel that being aroused by Trump all the time is actually a politics and a form of engagement. You know, so you spend all day long consuming stuff that it's like a narcotic. It's
feel you've
terrible.
done something.
And you feel like because it arouses you. You're tired at the end of the day because you've been so aroused. Well, that, you know, I think we're talking about a different model of journalism that speaks to people where they live, in the places they live, where they can recognize their own reality. And so, you know, I mean, that's very much, yeah.
Can anybody make a living at that?
No, you know, nobody makes a living in journalism. Or, you know, a handful of people make a living. So, I mean, we should recognize that that's sort of the nature of the Guild. I mean, I hugely appreciate the union efforts to alter that.
We're like teachers.
But most journalism careers, you know, especially now, there's a huge self-subsidy to build those clips and you know, your resume as a writer. And I don't see that changing, but there are ways in which we can be, I mean, I think the other thing we haven't talked about that is changing, and certainly the way we work, it reflects this, but it's across, you know, more elite institutions as well. There's a much more collaborative ethos in journalism right now, all sorts of partnerships. When you were talking about the Tribune with the tapes, you know, our practice is when we, you know, most notably with the police disciplinary records that we got through litigation, you know, a legacy news organization would generally hold on to that. Even I write for The Intercept, those folks have held on to the NSA papers and harvest them for stories. I won't speak of the Sun-Times, but certainly the Tribune, if they had a comparable trove of documents, would hold on to them. Our practice was to say, when we said public, we meant public. You know, when we asserted in court that there was not the, you know, kind of suspect logic that we as journalists are proxies for the public, that's just self-serving. And so I put millions of dollars into building something called the Citizens Police Data Project that makes public and Sun-Times reporters use it all the time. That turned out that sort of open, hospitable, collaborative stance has created so much value for us. There is a hive of journalists, researchers, civil rights lawyers who are digging into that data, informing our work, extending our reach. And so thinking about how we create both, you know, sort of community and fellowship in the field in a hard time, and creating value through collaboration. And there are all sorts of, I think, untapped possibilities in that respect. So, you know, we're all kind of, I've often joked that it's not true at the moment, but for most of my career as a writer, I've occupied a kind of hunter and gatherer economy, you know, and I think for most young reporters, that's just the nature of it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be a solitary, you know, harrowing experience. There can be a sense of fellowship and possibility.
So this is an area where all of us have to get smarter, and the Guild, I think, is going to tackle this, I hope, because it's an issue for everyone. There are community newspapers, there are lots of people doing reporting in neighborhoods. City Bureau is one, but there are many where the journalists don't really get paid, right? And then they come to me and say, we have this great stuff, we'd like to, you know, use your pages to help get it out. And I have to say, well, wait a minute, I actually pay the journalists, you know, I can't take the stuff for free. And so there's a limit. We have to figure out what this model is that's going to be sustainable and be community-based, right? That there has to be a pathway for people, which is partly what Maya's talking about, that lets everybody who's in journalism get paid and have a life.
But I think that's also where the nonprofit piece can connect to the corporate news model, but it's the nonprofit piece that creates that opportunity.
Yeah, the nonprofit piece and the corporate piece don't.
They're not necessarily antagonistic. We're not there, but it's possible.
We're getting there.
We have to, we're losing some of our panelists, so I guess we should close this down. Thank everybody for showing up and our panelists for lending us their time.